and
So it was sort of the end.
And
Yeah.
there was a lot of, so what we want to do is, for you, an American coming
Yeah.
over as a painter, but then we also wanted to talk a lot about the musical, the music end of it, you know. So what your expectations were when
Yes.
you arrived in Paris. Here you are, an American painter. What were you looking for? What were you trying to escape from, if you were, in terms of the climate? Because this was a kind of McCarthy period in America, isn't it?
Yes, it was that, but
Yeah, you can tell me
I
that.
wasn't running away from
No,
that.
I know you weren't running away from it.
In fact, I came to Paris with a message that I had in my back pocket, which was that America was producing the best painting in the world, and that we were much further along the way of having created a new avant-garde. I mean, abstract expressionism was in its full flower before I left New York and came to Paris. And so, although I didn't know exactly what to expect when I got there, I wasn't there very long before I realized that there was nothing in Paris as far as I was concerned. I could also, you know, with hindsight, I look back and I realized that I wasn't willing to accept a lot of perhaps, you know, painting that was going on that was much more interesting than I would have given credit for at the time. But still, I came pretty cocky, thinking that New York, with its great flowering of abstract expressionism, was really announcing something that nowhere else in the world had there been, you know, anything that equaled it. So that was sort of in my baggage, as it were, when I came, and at the same time, there's a certain on the other end of the pole, as it were, I was had a certain modesty that I was coming to a place that was historically the most remarkable, had the most remarkable cultural history. Just a few years before that, I was a student at the Art Students League and studied with a Japanese-American artist named Yasu Kuniyoshi. And there was a guy there named Walter Plate who had just come back from Paris, having studied with Léger on the GI Bill. And I remember being so thrilled to meet this guy because he had actually been in touch with one of the great artists of the world. And so it was my first encounter with someone on that, you know, someone who had touched that higher level. So coming to Paris was also, in a way, an anticipation that I might come close to some of the great artists that I had, you know, read about, heard about, or whose work I'd seen, or that I'd seen only in reproduction, whatever. And a lot of that turned, you know, some of it at least turned out to be true.
Who did you meet then? I mean, which of those? I mean, did you meet any of the?
The greatest artist I met was Picasso. I also met Miro, and I met Miro's great ceramist collaborator, Lorenz Artigas. Actually, it was through him that I came to meet Miro, because a cousin of mine, a French cousin, an artist who was also married to an artist, had introduced me to Artigas, who in turn introduced me to Miro, and by accident it happened that Picasso came to an opening of Miro's in Nice, and I met Picasso. It's a nice story.
What was that encounter like? Could you tell us something?
Yeah, I will. I was traveling with Gregory Corso, who we've spoken about, and we were kind of bumming around the south of France. Nice was kind of the center of our activity. I had an old beat-up Austin car that Sam Francis had given me in Paris. It was like lying there rotting in the back of his studio in Arcueil. And I said, "Hey, what are you going to do with that car?" He said, "You want it?" I said, "Well, yeah." And he says, "Well, look, it needs a new engine and it needs some tires, but I think I know where you can have all that done for very little money." And so, to make a long story short, I had this car, it was operating, and there we were. We'd driven down to the south of France from Paris, and we were sort of bumming around, back like a couple of beat characters, you know, paint stained and eager and cocky to sort of display ourselves before the public, and it was our habit, our way, to arrive in the village early in the morning before the marketplace had opened. We'd set up our easels, and I taught Gregory how to paint. And one of the crazy routines we used to do that really threw everybody into a state of shock was that we would both paint on the same painting. See, and this was part of our whacked out sort of philosophy about how we were going to, in a way, make a new kind of statement. And at the same time, it had a spiritual quotient to it, that we were transcending the idea of personal aesthetic philosophy by mixing the whole thing up and, just going forward with this. And it was a kind of a war, and it was a playful war, like a chess game in a sense, where we agreed that we had the right to wipe out whatever the other artist did. And so Gregory was on my left and I was on the right. It's interesting to think back on his being on the left and my being on the right, because I was the one who knew how to paint, and of course Gregory didn't. So I tended to be a little more conservative in the sense that I could actually render some things, that Gregory couldn't. And we would set ourselves up in the village square. There'd be a little church there. We'd start out making kind of a conventional landscape, of the village square. But soon enough, it started to get really crazy, and all sorts of elements would land in there, and he would do something I didn't like, and I'd brush it out, and I would do something he didn't like, and he'd brush it out. So soon enough, we had a crowd of people, around us. Meanwhile, we had various paintings that we had done lined up along the edge of the fountain, and we had a tin cup sitting there on the ground in anticipation of some contributions, which we got. And not only did we get contributions, we also sold some paintings. I mean, they were cheap enough, like only a couple of dollars, and you could walk away with an original Kanovitz Corso. Let's see, how did we get to this
That's
part?
an extraordinary story. I never heard anything about this.
I have some of those works. Oh yeah,
some.
yeah. I don't have them here, unfortunately. Yeah. They're in my stored archives out in Southampton.
It's incredible. I don't think anybody knew Corso ever painted. And
oh, listen, everybody knows that Corso does some visual arts because Gregory is a terrific cartoonist. He can make these wonderful little mystical cartoons. He was able to do that even then. Later, he became a collagist, and he would take postcards and cut them up and rearrange them and create new cities, like postcards of London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, whatever. He would gather up all these postcards and cut them all up and then use all the architectural stuff and kind of paste on top of paste and create a new city. And they were wonderful things. I mean, Gregory, if he had decided to devote himself to visual arts, I think could have really done something at it. Oh, wait, to get back to the Picasso story. All right. So, on one of our trips, we went into Spain, specifically because I had a connection through my cousin to go and meet Lorenz Artigas, famous collaborator with Miro. They did the UNESCO Arch, big, very well-known piece of ceramic sculpture, all decorated by Miro. And many, many other things. We had a wonderful time there, a terrific lunch with this Catalonian artist who then told us that he had a show opening in Nice on all these collaborations with Miro, and would we come? Of course, we would come. And so we saved the date. We left the end of that day and continued. Oh, we went to Barcelona. Stayed in Barcelona for several days, then came back to France, specifically in time to go to this opening at a very, very fancy gallery in Nice, the Matarazzo Gallery. So we arrived there at opening time. I guess it was somewhere around 6 in the evening, and it was very posh. We were like bums. I mean, you can't imagine the attire. With espadrilles that were sort of totally worn out, paint-stained pants. And we'd actually even made a little effort to kind of clean up our act to come to this. I mean, we did the best we could. We come into the gallery, and immediately this Catalonian Artigas comes running up with generous hugs and welcomes and, oh, here are my American friends and da-da-da. And this introduces us to this dealer who, whose gallery it is, and he suddenly realized, here are a couple of freaks. What do I want these guys here? It's like, so he took an instantaneous dislike to us and sort of tried to get us off to one side. Here, have a drink, why don't you go? So, in the meantime, this is quite odd too and very interesting. Miro, who he'd been quickly introduced to, and then he was shuffled away, had cut out from paper shapes that were like a necktie, right? And they had two little tabs. And he had a whole bunch of chalks in his pocket. And he would come up to a guest, and he would make a quick little Miro design. Then he'd slip this paper tie into the collar of this person, who responded very graciously and thanking Miro. And he was doing this like a little clown. I mean, he was really having a terrific time, enjoying himself, kind of, one could say, a little childlike. It was and all this was going on. People were drinking, chatting, and then all of a sudden, there's a silence. The whole room becomes quiet. And we were in the opposite end of the room, and I turn around to see that from the entrance door, a kind of aisle was created. And through the door came this little bronzed character in beige linen pants, sandals, and a kind of taupe-colored T-shirt with maybe 3 or 4 people to either side of him. And it was as if a king had walked into the room, and people were, if not curtsying, close to it, and shaking his hand, and Picasso would come and say hello to this one, hello to that one, and he walked down this aisle. We were at the absolute end of it. And, he was being guided by the gallery dealer, Mr. Matarazzo, and when they came close to us, Picasso said, "Who are they?" And Matarazzo says, "Oh, don't bother." He says, "No, I want to meet them." So Picasso comes right up to us, and I say to him in French, "I'm an American painter, Howard Kanovitz, and this is my friend, American poet Gregory Corso." Picasso says, "Well, you're a painter." I said, "Yes." And he said to me, "Et moi aussi je suis peintre." And he said, "What kind of name is Kanovitz?" I said, "Well, it was changed from Kaganovich. It was a Russian name. My parents were from Russia." Really, he lit up. He was really interested to know that I was the child of Russian parents. And he wanted to know how old my parents were when they came to America, what to this, that. And we had this conversation. Meantime, Matarazzo was tugging at him to get him away. And Gregory, in the meantime, is saying, ask him what he thinks of bathtubs." I said, "Please, give me a break. I can't get into this." This was frequently the case between Gregory and I. Gregory wanted to pop absurdist, surrealist kinds of questions to people wherever he met them, and I was trying to chill him out. So anyway, to sort of put a cap on this story, it wasn't until a few years later, when I came back to New York, that I picked up Apollinaire's book on the Cubist painters. And there was in one chapter, there was a mention of the fact that there was a kind of club that was created among the Cubist painters as a kind of a social club, and in a way it was also a little bit of a joke. The name of the club was Et moi aussi je suis peintre. And they reproduced a little membership card. So when Picasso said that to me, it was not only this charming, graceful thing for him to say to a young American painter, it was also popped into his head at that moment, something that had gone on 50 years before in his own young life, of this club that they had made called Et moi aussi je suis peintre. Terrific.
Okay, now what we want...
Just remove this just a touch in order to...
Now, what we want to do is...
Yeah.
I mean, that's terrific. I never heard any of this. I don't know how I missed it. Maybe I don't listen to you. But anyway, you've got so much to say. What I'd love to hear about now is coming to... As a painter, you're also a musician. And you found there was a tremendous amount of activity going on in America, I mean in Paris, which was very largely the fact that that black American musicians found a kind of refuge and an extraordinary welcome in Paris, didn't they?
Definitely.
Powell.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
They were
Can you tell
in
us about
Paris.
this and how you got in and played with them and the
Well, of course.
Camille Young and everything?
Okay.
And your own background as a
Yeah.
jazz player, yeah.
Of course, I started out as a jazz player before I was a painter, and I had a career as a musician. I played in big bands. I played in small groups. I thought that my calling in life was as a musician. I didn't start in art school until I was 22 years old. I had started playing my instrument when I was 9. By the time I was 13, I was in a youth band. And we had actually played on the radio, and there was a kind of stage father in all this. Tommy Marshall's father was like a very ambitious guy who wanted his son and his son's band to achieve Major Bowes Radio Amateur Hour. It was a famous thing in the 30s to get on to this program. And many people who subsequently became famous in the entertainment world started out as... performers on Major Bowes' Radio Amateur Hour. So that was his goal for us, and he had us all dressed up in white dinner jackets and bought us bandstands. That was the beginning of my musical career. From there, I was in the union, musicians union, when I was 16. I was already playing in bands when I was 17. So I did this for, a good 5-6 years on a professional level before I decided to stop what I was doing, go to art school, which is a whole other story that I don't think you need to hear now, and change careers. I mean, I didn't even think of art as a career, really. I was going towards something that fascinated me, that had some kind of compelling call to me. And it was a drummer, actually, who was an art student who introduced me to this, got me interested in it. So it was perfectly natural for me at that time, 1956, to take my instrument. I took my trombone to Paris with me, and I had expected, because I'd already spoken to a couple of people. Larry Rivers was one. David Amram was another. In fact, I met Amram just after he had come back from Paris in around 1953, I think it was. And Amram was telling me about all the different places you could play in Paris, the Taboo, the Chat qui Pêche, the Rose Rouge at that time, which was closed by the time I got there. But the Camillon, the Chat qui Pêche, and the Taboo were all lively, active jam joint. I mean, places that would sometimes hire musicians to play, but most of the time it was a place where musicians gathered late at night after they had finished with their gigs and would come there to play for their own pleasure. So that was alive and well when I arrived in Paris. The musicians who were coming through Paris, I mean, the French musicians themselves were already very, very on a very high level of accomplishment. They had listened to all the records. They knew everything that was going on. And so the quality of the music was already good. There was the Club Saint-Germain on Rue Saint-Benoît that had stars. Miles Davis absolutely shook up Paris. I mean, the French jazz musicians, just all of them wanted to emulate Miles, not only his good points, but his bad habits as well. There were a lot of drugs in Paris. There was, I mean, aside from hash, there was plenty of heroin, and a lot of the musicians were into it. But the musical activities were frequent. I mean, there was always, in fact, one of the things that I discovered about Paris was there was always a place to find, to play. I mean, you could always find a place to play, which was a little more difficult in a way in New York. There weren't that many venues. I mean, the whole musical scene was lively. Bud Powell came to Paris. The Modern Jazz Quartet came to Paris. These were famous American artists who were circulating around and meeting French jazz musicians and influencing them enormously. The American musicians who had come to Paris and had stayed were like, well, Bud Powell came and stayed in Paris for months and months at a time. There was a guy named Art Simmons who settled in Paris, I forget the name of the place that he used to play in, but he used to do a piano duo. In fact, I think there was another pianist that together with Art Simmons did a jazz piano duo in some club on the right bank. This was mostly left bank oriented, by the way. Also Stefan Grappelli. I don't know if you remember that I lived in the Hotel Cristal. Grappelli lived there as well, and he had an interesting history of his own, having been one of the founders of the Hot Club of Paris along with Django Reinhardt. So that was sort of the climate of it. It was American jazz musician Al Levitt was there, Lloyd Thompson was there, he was a Canadian bass player. They had just been playing with a Dutch pianist named Pia Beck and had come from Scheveningen into Paris. So there was all this, coming and going.
All that lasted for a while, but then it changed, didn't it? Then after a while, then the black musicians didn't hang out
If
anymore
it
in
changed,
Paris.
it changed after I left, because I was there from 56 to 58, and during those two to 2.5 years, it was very, very lively.
What drew them to Paris?
Well, I think that all those musicians have spoken of it, and probably more eloquently than I can, but I think they felt that they were entertainers in America, in the sense of being like lower down the artistic ladder, whereas in Paris they felt they were artists, that they had been given acceptance and a status that went beyond the color line, beyond anything, to make them feel that their creative contribution was what was of most importance. And they felt comfortable in Paris. Many of them had French girlfriends. There wasn't that kind of color line, because there was still no matter how dynamic the American jazz scene was, there was still the ghetto. It was Harlem, and that's really where black musicians lived for the most part. I mean, there were few adventurous ones who were beginning to mix in with white society. For example, when I had a studio on 2nd Avenue around the corner from me, Elvin Jones shared a place with Pepper Adams. Bobby Timmons, great pianist for the Art Blakey Jazz Messengers. These guys lived very close to me, and frequently I had music sessions, jazz sessions at my loft, which also started often at between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning and lasted until daybreak. So that's the best way I can answer your question in terms of why they came there. I think, too, they felt there was a history in France of an appreciation for American jazz that was already there to welcome them. But more than anything, I think when they arrived, they felt like they were being treated as true artists.
How's that? There's something else you want to ask? I mean, he seems to have covered the painting very well, and the jazz very well.
I think just talk a little bit, Howard, about arriving in the city. I know Peter asked you when you first started about what you thought you were coming to. How did the city feel when you arrived? I mean, you arrived as an artist, as a creative person. So what was it you picked up on when you arrived?
One thing that I came with, along with the slight cockiness I spoke of, was also a kind of desire to find out who I was. And I thought, I'd been a musician, and now I was a painter, and then I was even sort of thinking I could write some poetry or something. So I had a kind of open-ended quest for allying myself or connecting myself with higher goals in life. That was to come in touch with great art, great artists, to come in touch with great music, great musicians, to even come in touch with a literary scene, which I didn't altogether do, but somehow or other it was in the air. It was just something that was close by, and Giacometti was sitting there at the cafe floor right on the corner of Boulevard Saint-Germain and Rue Saint-Benoît. I went to see this guy, Gabriel Pomeran, and I'm there in his apartment. He introduces me to Jean Genet. Things like that, where it was like the atmosphere was loaded with these things that I had hoped for, but couldn't particularly identify. I didn't know what or who was going to happen to me when I arrived in Paris, but I did anticipate the possibility. Like I said, having met this guy Walter Plate, the student, my fellow student in Kuniyoshi's class, had been a student of Leger. That stuck in my mind as something that I would love to encounter if I could be so lucky, and that did happen from time to time. So,
that's fine, isn't it?
No, that's
Splendid.
absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's fantastic. Just tell me, you said Miles Davis and Bud Powell were there.
Mm-hmm.
And tell me a little bit about where they were playing. What kind of places were they playing?
Both of them played in the Club Saint-Germain. The Club Saint-Germain was the prime jazz club in Paris then, and it was on Rue Saint-Benoît, absolutely across the street from the hotel.
I could just make a technical point. We won't use her question, so you have to say who you're talking about, Bud Powell and Miles Davis.
Oh, I see.
You answered the question, but didn't rename them, so if you could just start again.
Okay. Bud Powell and Miles Davis and the Modern Jazz Quartet all performed in the Club Saint-Germain, and that was the preeminent jazz joint. It was quite an elegant place, and it was a cellar, and ordinarily they charged quite a lot to come in, but there was a guy who was sort of the producer of the place, and he would hand out membership cards to people like myself, who he thought was like, maybe I was a minor player on the scene, but someone he could do a favor to. And so I had this little membership card that got me into the Club Saint-Germain without paying the cover charge, and I could hang out at the bar. There was a club called the Trois Maillettes, but that club catered to swing players and Dixieland players. That element also existed in Paris at the same time. Kansas Fields was a musician in Paris then, and he held, and Sidney Bechet, too, was very much a presence in Paris. And my friend Al Levitt, the drummer who died several years ago in Paris, by the way, I might have introduced you to Al Levitt at one time or another at the Old Navy where we used to hang out, because I have a photograph of Gregory, Mike Zwerin, Al Levitt, myself, Zoot Sims, all sort of in a row at the banquette of the Old Navy. This photograph must have been taken in 1957. But it was in those days that I think you were more,
Yeah.
what was that place?
I used to go to the Monaco.
Monaco.
It was cheaper, horrible
The
place.
Monaco.
And then we go to the Tournon, but he also
Tournon.
the Tournon we went to. But what we really went to was I don't remember the place where they had crepes and everything. Chez Maurice, where they had Boris Vian. They were much cheaper because the Old Navy was a little more pricey than the Monaco, and the Tournon was where you go late at night.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And
That was on Monsieur Le Prince. Was that right?
Rue Monsieur Le Prince.
Rue Monsieur Le Prince.
And the Old Navy was, well, it was, if you wanted to keep away from the ordinary riffraff from the Monaco, you went to the Old Navy, to have a quiet talk.
Yeah.
That's great.
How was that?
That was fantastic.